Welcome to the Evening Review. My name is Juane, and joining us virtually is hemp and cannabis activist Angela Prusa. Before we go into that interview, however, we'll go for a short commercial break. Good day, Angela. How are you? And welcome to the Evening Review.
Thank you so much. I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
Just tell us a bit about the work that you're doing with regards towards promoting the legalized use of cannabis, and give us an intro into what hemp is.
Great. So I have been advocating for the legalization of cannabis in hemp and Namibia, and my main focus with this work is to try and educate people on the facts around cannabis and around hemp so that we can move away from the stigmatization and the fear around this plant and move into a space of where we understand this plant and we understand how to work with this plant, we understand the harms, we understand the benefits. And the difference between hemp and cannabis, essentially they are the same genetic plant. They slightly differ in their THC content. So hemp is usually known as its industrial use is what hemp is known for, and it grows slightly different than cannabis in that it grows more taller, not so bushy, but also all the things that can be made from hemp can also be made from the cannabis stalk, which I'm actually recently getting really into the research of that.
And then I want to know from your end, what are the general misconceptions around cannabis and hemp, because there seems to be a lot of negative press that these products seem to get.
Yeah, so there's a lot of fear surrounding this plant, and I think that comes from a lack of understanding, and then it comes from the fact that cannabis has been criminalized as well as hemp and has been illegal for such a long time. So there's been this fear and this stigmatization around the plant, and a lot of it has to do, people always have these stories about, someone smoked cannabis and lost their mind, and people get really addicted to cannabis. And we're not disputing that there's no harms to cannabis. We don't advocate for the youth or for teenagers to utilize plant unless they are ill and they need to use it as medicine. But also a lot of these stories are hearsay. For example, there's the one that people always utilize is the fact that cannabis is a gateway drug, which that has been disproven so many times. If we look at what a gateway drug is, which is a substance that leads you on to utilizing more strong substances, essentially, alcohol is a gateway drug. Alcohol is a substance that most people start with to, use and then move on to other substances from there. And also in terms of the actual harms of cannabis, alcohol and tobacco are more harmful than cannabis, yet we treat cannabis as if it's as harmful as heroin and crack and cocaine, etc., which it is not. So it's about the informed understanding around the plant. And like I said, I am not advocating for the fact that cannabis has no harms, or that there's no mental addiction to cannabis, but we have to look at this from an informed point of view and not from this fear-based point of view that we have in Namibia, where people think one puff of cannabis is going to send you mad. And that's absolutely, it's not true. It is based on some fear-mongering and these stories that people spread, the sensationalism, the drama.
I would like to know from your end, as an advocate for the use of cannabis and hemp, what are some of the initiatives or what are some of the things that you are doing to promote the message around its safe and responsible use? What have you done to convince society at large that it is in fact not dangerous? And are you engaged with government? Are you engaged with civil society? Are you engaged with, for example, the police to bring about to sort of do away with that misconception around the uses of cannabis and hemp?
Yeah, so I've been doing this close to 7 years now in Namibia, and I've had a lot of conversations within government and with lawmakers, from law reform to the various ministries, to health professionals, in providing them with the research around cannabis and the evidence and the statistics. Because also the one thing that I just have to add in here with cannabis is the fact that the criminalization of cannabis is not based on its harms. It is based on a racist narrative that was enforced by the apartheid government of South Africa, the colonial government in South Africa. So I think that's a really important fact to remember when we talk about cannabis legalization and why we advocate for the legalization of it, because we have to redeem this racist apartheid law. And especially in a free and independent Namibia, currently the prohibition of cannabis violates the human rights of the cannabis users in Namibia. I focus a lot in civil society on education, in communities, explaining about cannabis, and also showing the products that we can make from cannabis, bricks, textiles, paper, animal feed, biofuel. We can build houses from this plant, and also the fact that we can utilize this plant as a medicine. So I have spent a lot of time speaking to civil society in Namibia, doing panels, doing education, trying to do it via newspaper articles, via flyers, via standing on the street and talking about it, so that people can get the education around this plant, and also to understand, for example, in Namibia, a lot of people that perceive something that the youth are smoking to be cannabis is not pure cannabis. A lot of the cannabis that we find on our streets in Namibia has been grown, with a lot of chemicals. It has been sprayed with chemicals to get it across the borders, to mask the smell of it. Also, it has been laced with stronger chemical drugs to make it more addictive, because that is more profitable for the drug dealers. So essentially, what people are consuming, is not pure cannabis. And so oftentimes then the effect is a negative effect on the body, on the mind. And also a lot of people mix cannabis, for example, with mandrax and have these severe reactions from it. And then people attribute that reaction to the cannabis and not the actual mandrax that was smoked with the cannabis. And it is the same thing that I've noticed. For example, I'm a NADA acupuncture practitioner. I work with trauma and addiction, and I work with severely addicted individuals in Namibia, who have no support. And essentially, a lot of the drugs in the people smoke, for example, mandrax, they smoke it on cannabis, yet perceive that people are smoking cannabis and not understanding that actually they are smoking mandrax. So that's been my focus, to liaise with government, with health professionals. I've tried to engage the police on various occasions, but they don't seem to be very receptive to any education around cannabis, unfortunately. But we keep trying to engage them, to educate them on this plant, because essentially they are the ones who are violating people's human rights, by going into their houses, breaking down their doors, humiliating them, physically assaulting them.
Angela, I'd like to interrupt you for a minute, Angela.
Yes.
I'd like to pick up this discussion. We're going to have to go for a short break. Do stay tuned. More of the discussion on hemp and cannabis and the perceived destruction that it causes in society. A short break. Welcome back to the evening review. Angela, I asked you about the impact of cannabis in society, or the perceived negative implications that it has. Before we went into the break, you were saying?
Yeah, so in terms of the negative impact cannabis has on the communities, we in Namibia have a huge issue with addiction. And that is not just, that's alcohol, that's all sorts of substances which are causing a lot of issues in our society. And essentially what we need to look at is the fact that, we have lack of opportunity, we have widespread poverty, we have a lot of trauma in Namibia. And unless we address those root causes, that's not going to change. And the fact that people are so scared of the legalization of cannabis, and saying, but there's so many problems with cannabis in communities, but we have alcohol and cigarettes that are more harm than cannabis, and we find them regulated and readily available to buy on our shelves. And essentially, the way that we can support communities and support this issue of drug use is by being able to have these conversations with people, like being able to identify vulnerable people and giving them the help that they need. Like I said, we are not advocating for the youth to utilize this substance, any substance for that matter, but also there's a lack of proper informed education around cannabis and the potential harm of it, and how to use it, for example, in a safe manner. So I think this is the way that we lessen the impact and the harms of substances in communities, is not by criminalizing people and putting them in cages, but it is by supporting communities, by creating opportunities, by creating industries, which all of these things cannabis is able to do. We are able to create industries, create jobs, we are able to make medicines from it, and by legalizing a substance like cannabis, it is harm reduction, because essentially people are using cannabis in Namibia at a really widespread rate, at a really high rate all across the country. If we can improve the quality, make sure that there's oversight of the quality, put an age restrictions, regulate, then this is harm reduction for our communities. And this is what lawmakers and the police need to understand. Because currently, if you use cannabis in the privacy of your own home without harming anyone, you are deemed a criminal. But you are able to use alcohol and tobacco freely, and the consequences that come with it, But that human right of utilizing alcohol and that freedom to utilize it is being allocated to some people in Namibia. But to the cannabis users, that freedom to use cannabis is not allocated. So it's a violation of people's human rights, essentially.
I'd like to know, since you are advocating for the legalized use of hemp and cannabis, if it were to be legalized or decriminalized, how best then should government then, how would this be regulated to ensure that it is done in a responsible manner and that it does not lead to issues of addiction and issues of dependence, and that it does not become a societal ill?
Well, so this is where, essentially people who have the expertise in this plant, or those who have been working with this plant come, for many years, come into play to create legislation that has oversight, legislation that controls the quality of the product, that makes sure that, the product is grown in Namibia, so that there's transparency and oversight into how it is grown, who grows it, where it comes from. But essentially, when we talk about, the dependency, people are already utilizing cannabis. There's thousands of people in Namibia who smoke cannabis, who go to work every day, who are not harming anyone, who are utilizing cannabis, whether it is for pleasure, for spiritual use, for religious use, for medical use. And they lead normal lives, they have positions, whether they are doctors, lawyers, bakers, like NGO or whatever they do, whatever role they play in society. We have huge amounts of people who function and utilize cannabis just as someone would utilize alcohol. So this whole fear around the fact that, all of a sudden, if we legalize cannabis, everyone's going to use it and everyone's going to get addicted, that is just a fear-based perception. Because if we look at countries that have legalized cannabis, we see that this is not the reality. That addiction of cannabis doesn't all of a sudden increase. People who get addicted to substances, whether a substance is legal or illegal, can be helped, can be or will be more willing to come forward, for example, if they know that they're not going to get criminalized. Because currently people who potentially need help for, a dependence on a substance are scared to come forward because of the stigma and because of the criminalization surrounding it. So essentially, if we can, invest the money that cannabis can bring through taxes, for example, and create more accessible rehab facilities, and more outreach programs with social workers who are trauma-informed and understand substances and dependency and addiction, this is how we mitigate any harm. But this can only be done when it's a collaborative effort between those who understand cannabis and the government, because the government essentially doesn't have any knowledge on cannabis, and neither do the health, professionals within Namibia. All they know is that cannabis is bad. But there's a whole people within society who are using this plant very responsibly and who are using this plant as a medicine. And so it is just about bringing this underground, already, their movement into, into the mainstream society in Namibia.
Then, Angela, I'd like to know, what efforts have you led to bring concrete evidence to Namibia to bring about this point, or to lawmakers rather, to bring about this point that the use of cannabis can be safe, it can be used in a safe, responsible manner? Have you presented any papers? What is the evidence? Have you done any evidence? Have you presented this? Are there any studies looking into its safe use within Namibia?
So unfortunately, we can't do our own research because of, the illegality of cannabis. What I have done is I've collected a lot of anecdotal evidence, of cannabis uses within Namibia, which have been presented to the government. What also has been presented to the government is a lot of evidence-based research on harms of cannabis, longitudinal studies on, cannabis and memory, on addiction, the models of places that have legalized cannabis and what that looks like after 1 year, 2 years, how does it affect society, what has changed. So a lot of evidence has been given to the government and presented to the government in terms of, research, in terms of multi-sector studies, in terms of expertise, neuroscientists, addiction experts, cannabis experts from all over the world have had dialogue with me, and I've presented the evidence to our government. Unfortunately, I'm not sure why very often that evidence gets ignored, and rather people stick to the stigma that they know, and continue to just perpetuate that same narrative rather than looking at the available evidence. But that evidence has been, submitted. That's also why we've seen a shift in the public in Namibia. The conversation about cannabis, what it was 5-6 years ago to now, has changed dramatically, because more and more people have looked, at the articles that, I've put in the newspaper, or the interviews that I've done on the television, to understand, okay, maybe this plant isn't as what people have said it is, and done their own research online, because more studies have been done on cannabis in the last 50 years than, for example, on grandpa and panado. So the evidence is there, people just need to go and read the evidence.
And then, Angela, in closing, last question for me is, for the rest of the calendar year remaining, what are some of the activities that you are going to be involved in to sort of promote the message of the safe use of hemp and cannabis, and to advocate for its legalization? In brief, please.
So at the moment, my focus is very much on really pushing and engaging the public and the government to understand that we need to, very urgently start creating a hemp industry. Climate change is very real, and the effects are being felt. We have huge amounts of people without jobs, and we have a lack of industry in our rural areas. And all of this can be achieved with, hemp, cannabis, instead of, for example, drilling for fossil fuels as we are currently doing. So my focus at the moment is to bring the evidence so that we move away from fossil fuels and mining that destroys our environment, and we look at sustainable practices that are good for our earth, that empower our communities, that are sustainable resources, so that we make sure that our future generations, will still benefit from these resources. And then as well with the cannabis, I just continue to, focus on, I'm trying to bring more education around cannabis and the safe use of cannabis to communities, that don't have access to Wi-Fi, and trying to do it in the local languages as well. We're always doing a lot of things behind the scenes at the Cannabis and Hemp Association of Namibia, which, if people want to go and check out the website, it's www.cannabisnamibia.org, and we'll keep posting updates there as well. And I'll just continue as well to keep, having these conversations on
And that concludes the evening review for this evening. For more on this, do check out our YouTube and Facebook channels. Thank you for joining us. Good night.